Hi everyone, welcome to this video. There's one question I get quite a lot. Should you learn front-end web development, back-end web development, or full-stack web development? What are the advantages of each, and what is it actually about? And which one should you choose? Let me try to answer this in this video. So front-end versus back-end versus full-stack. What's the right one? Let's first of all clarify what's what. So as you know, the web works like this. We have users using the browser, be that on a desktop machine or the mobile phone, or of course other clients like mobile apps, but let's keep it simple. So users using the browser, and we have servers. Servers where our website runs on, where it is hosted. The browsers send requests when we visit a certain domain, and the server returns a response. Thus far, nothing special. Now, the part on the browser is referred to as the front end. So the user interface which we render there, which consists of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. More on that in a second. The part on the server, which is responsible for returning that page, but also which is responsible for storing user data in a database, fetching data from a database, that is referred to as the backend. So these two ends communicate with each other, and that is relatively straightforward. The end which you see as a user, which you directly interact with, is the front end, and the part which does work behind the scenes is the back end. Now, what's full stack development? Full stack development is both together. Of course, you as a developer can work on both the back end. You write your own server-side code, you write your own logic on the server, you access the database, and you can also be responsible for the front end, for the user interface you're rendering. You can do both, and then you're a full stack developer. So that is the big picture. Let's now take a closer look. I decided to create 4 boxes which we can use to talk about these ends. And let's start with front-end development. Let's have a look at the technologies and programming languages you're about to use when you become a front-end developer. Obviously, that is important because you gotta know if you enjoy working with these technologies, because if you don't enjoy it, you'll not have the greatest time of your life working as a front-end developer. You'll work a lot with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. That is your bread and butter tech stack as a front-end developer, because as a front-end developer, you will build user interfaces. You will build stuff that runs in the browser. You'll not build stuff that runs on a server that uses a server-side language. Therefore, you'll probably not just need the basics about these languages, but advanced knowledge, and also knowledge about things like CSS preprocessors, things like Sass, stylus, which make writing CSS code easier. You also want to know some JavaScript libraries like Node.js and frameworks like Angular, React. Yes, that's a library, but let's put it into that basket because we use it as an alternative to Angular or Vue. Vue. So these are the things you work with, and these are the things you gotta know. And obviously, in general, you gotta know that ecosystem around it. You gotta know how to use other third-party libraries that might be connected to React, let's say, React Router. You have to feel confident working with these libraries, and you have to know what they do and how they connect. And you will also have to know some build tools. You will have to know what NPM does, what Webpack does. At least basic knowledge about how to configure it is definitely required. So this is your workspace. This is what you work with. This is what you have to know. Now you work with these technologies, but what are you working on? You'll build JavaScript-driven user interfaces. And that means you'll build what the user sees. You'll build all the forms, the widgets the user uses, drag and drop things, everything the user interacts with, depending on what you're building that has moderate or very high complexity. You'll also be responsible for creating reusable UI components with JavaScript and CSS, especially when working with a component-driven framework like Angular, React, or Vue. But in general, you'll work a lot with CSS, and you will build things which you then repeat in your page. Therefore, your job will also be to think about what you need to build and then build it in a clever way so that you don't repeat yourself all the time. As I already mentioned, you'll work a lot with forms, and you'll have to validate the user input. Is that email address an email address? You'll have to answer that. But important, not because you're the final validation layer, you're not making the final decision whether this is valid, because your code can always be tricked. Since it runs in the browser, the user can always edit your code, but you'll do all of that to provide a good user experience. Because user interfaces is your job, user experiences is what it's finally all about. You'll also have to work with the backend. You'll have to decide how to communicate with the backend. Does that form send a post request, or do you use an AJAX request? Are you building a single-page application with Angular, for example? These are things you'll have to know and you'll have to build. Finally, you'll probably also have to work on advanced user experience strategies, as I called it here. Things like adding offline capabilities, in general, progressive web app features to your app, or handling live updates, working with WebSockets. These are things which sometimes also touch backend topics, or where you have to know to which endpoint to connect, where you have to know which technologies your backend has to use, but you'll be responsible for working on that on the front end. Now, what's not so important for you? You'll not work that much with server-side languages. Node, PHP, knowing some basics always helps, but you don't need to be an expert. That's not your main job. You'll also not interact with databases. You'll probably not write any queries. So that's probably also something you don't have to worry about. You'll also don't dive into server configs. You don't necessarily do this as a backend developer, by the way, because that is the job of a server administrator, but as a front-end developer, it's definitely not your job. So these are the technologies you're not going to use. Now, you'll therefore not work on server-side logic of any kind. If you have a products app where users can issue orders, well, you'll not store them, you'll not handle them. You'll not implement user authentication on the backend. On the front end, yes, the forms, sending the data, validating it, yeah, but you'll not store it in a database. You'll not check if that password is correct. You'll also not send any emails or things like that. This is always something which gets triggered on the server, which gets executed with server-side code. And since I mentioned you won't work with databases, so you will not directly connect to any database. Your front-end code won't connect to databases. You'll reach out to backends, which then do the connection. You'll not do it directly. So that's the front-end development. What about backend? Got the same boxes, and it's basically, well, the opposite. For technologies, we need server-side technologies like Node, like PHP. We also will work with frameworks like Laravel for PHP or Express for Node. You will work with databases and query languages. Now, chances are you still don't need to know SQL in detail because you might use some package, some ORM, which basically takes the heavy lifting of writing such queries away from you, but still you'll interact with databases. You need to know some basics at least. You'll partly also be involved in server configuration. Now, typically that is of course the task of a server admin, but still you'll be involved in that. You'll have to think about things like logging strategies or how your app works together with the server, which server features do you need. So you will be involved with that. And you also have to have basic HTML, CSS, and JavaScript knowledge, but certainly no expert knowledge. But obviously you want to know what the frontend does, just as the frontend should have a basic idea of what you're doing. Now, what will you work on? You'll work on server-side business logic, things like user authentication, storing these orders, working with the database in general, automatic notifications, data validation, that's important. The front end does this too, but only to show an error message to the user. You will have the final say in whether something gets saved to the database or not, because the front end code can easily be hacked or tricked. Your code is way more secure because your users can't directly access it. Therefore, you'll have to validate any user input. You have the final say. And that's really important to understand. You on the backend really have to make sure that you secure your backend and your app overall, and that only checked data ends up in the database. Because working with the database and data storage in general, this also includes files, is of course your task. It's not happening on the front end. You connect to the database. And just in case you're wondering why we don't do that directly from the front end, well, technically that would be possible. But the credentials for working with a database should not be exposed to your users. On the server, users can't read your code. There, you can safely access the database. And there, you also can write code which can't be manipulated. Additionally, you will also probably be involved in setting up scheduled processes, like doing some calculations, cleanup processes. This is all server-side work. This is all happening on the servers. So it's not so much about user interfaces, not at all actually, but about all the heavy lifting, the core logic of your app. It's not more important than the front end. It's just another important building block. Because of course it's always important to provide a nice user interface, but thereafter something meaningful should happen. And that is then your task on the server side. Now, what's not so important for you? Regarding technologies, languages, you don't really need advanced JavaScript or CSS knowledge. Unless you're working with Node, then you should have advanced JavaScript knowledge at least. You'll also not really need JavaScript libraries or frameworks regarding the front end. If you're working with Node, you will have to understand how this ecosystem works, and you'll have to know which libraries and frameworks to use on the server, but you won't need to know Angular or React because that's a front-end framework. You'll also not need build tools that much. It always helps to understand some basics, and NPM, for example, is definitely needed if you're working with Node to install your local Node packages, but you won't need to know how to set up a build workflow with Webpack, which automatically compiles your Sass code to CSS code. That's not something you'll worry about. Now, what will you not build, therefore? You'll not build the client-side validation, for example. You'll do the server-side validation of user input. You'll not do it on the client side. In general, you'll not build the user interfaces. You might render simple ones or return some HTML here and there, but in general, you're not involved in that. You don't build complex user interfaces. And you therefore also don't need to know, or you won't work on advanced strategies that impact the user experience. Offline capabilities in your app, it's not really something you'll be involved in. It's not your core business. So that's the backend development. What about full stack? Full stack needs to know everything. You gotta know the basic technologies. You gotta know server-side technologies like Node, frameworks for the server side, front-end advanced knowledge for JavaScript and CSS, as well as libraries and frameworks for the front-end. You gotta know all that. You also gotta know how to interact with databases. The key thing is you'll probably not be an expert at all these fields. You just will know the basics, maybe the advanced basics, but rarely everything because, well, it's very complex. It's a lot. So pretty hard to know everything there. You'll work on everything. You'll work on both the server side and client side. You'll work on the user interfaces and the logic. You'll do the validation on both ends. On the client side for better user experience, for immediate errors. On the server side to make sure no invalid data ends up in the database. You'll also be responsible for storing files and data in general, data in the databases. So that will be your task. You'll do everything. That is the definition of full stack development. So what is not so important for you then? Advanced things. You don't need to know libraries and frameworks in every detail. You'll probably have some advanced knowledge, don't get me wrong, but you'll rarely have expert knowledge in all these things. Build tools. You gotta know the basics as for everything else, but you'll probably not be a super deep expert on them because you can use a lot of CLIs or templates to find your way around setting up everything on your own. And that, by the way, sounds negative. It's not meant to be. It's perfectly fine. You'll also not work on something. For example, very complex user interfaces, probably also something you won't work on. The same for very complex server-side logic. Since you won't have expert knowledge in a lot of things, you can't work on these super high sophisticated things. And that's not necessarily a huge issue because not every app, not every web project is super sophisticated. So it always sounds worse than it necessarily is. So what's better then? It sounded like full stack development is absolute garbage and you have to choose between front-end and back-end. Well, let's compare it. Front-end development offers great opportunities. It's an ecosystem or a technology stack which is evolving rapidly. We see a new JavaScript framework every day. It's really evolving super fast. We can do more and more in the browser. We got new browser APIs coming up every day. So the browser gets more and more capable. We can see that in the popularity of JavaScript. It's exploding because there's so much you can do. And therefore, there's high demand in developers. And that demand is still growing. To sum it up in a negative sentence, you're just doing the user interface though. And that, of course, is wrong. You're doing a lot in the browser. You're also doing things like caching things to provide offline access. But in the end, obviously, you always just work in the browser, which is a lot, but the browser. The backend, well, there, security stays important. And with ever more data and ever more touch points to our users, with more and more devices connecting to our service, we always need more and better algorithms and processes to handle all that incoming data, to do something meaningful with that. And therefore, the challenges are growing there too. We can do more and more, and obviously we therefore want to do more and more. So there too, we got a lot of opportunities and demand is growing. To also add a negative sentence here, you got no direct connection to your users or customers though. You, of course, write the core logic which they'll use or which will impact them. But since you're not designing the user interface, you're not the one fetching their data. You're not the one providing the user experience that ensures that users want to interact with your app. And that is, of course, something which you might be missing, or you're liking the fact that you could focus on the core business logic. Now, what about full stack development? Full stack development has one huge advantage. You can build everything on your own. You don't have any dependencies on backend experts or frontend experts. You got a full understanding of the complete tech stack you're working with. The backend is no black box to you. The frontend isn't either. That is huge. And that, of course, means that it's perfect for small companies and freelancers. I'd say it's rare that in super big projects in bigger companies, you work as a full stack developer. You typically specialize on something. Even as a front-end developer, you specialize on something. Maybe you're the guy for the authentication forms. Maybe you're the guy doing the CSS, depending on the project and the company size. But for smaller companies and for your startups or as a freelancer, you got all the power and you can do everything on your own, which is extremely, extremely valuable. The downside is, of course, you're a jack of all trades. This has advantages, but also disadvantages. You're not an expert in anything. That sounds hard, but you'll not master everything. That can be discouraging, or this can be a disadvantage. It's obviously always possible to specialize in one area thereafter, though. So a lot of people start off as full stack developers because you want to know the whole tech stack and then you specialize. Or you always stay a full stack developer because you say, hey, I'm a freelancer and I like the fact that I can pull off whole projects on my own. So I hope this gave you a bit of an overview, was a lot of talking. Let me know if such videos are interesting to you. I saw this question a lot and I hope I could clear up some confusion.